place by supply and demand, reward the success, and punish the inefficient. And that would be much better than with the government doing it.
Mr. President?
Well, let me be clear. Now, the government has to lead. Now, take transportation. We must invest in mass transit. And my goal is to give 80% of Americans access to high-speed rail.
Oh, that sounds good.
It sure does sound good, and maybe if the government got out of the way, we would have high-speed transportation. But we've had government involved in transportation for a long, long time.
But doesn't government need to spend the money to jumpstart this stuff?
But they don't have any money, and I don't like the idea. They might have good goals, but they don't recognize the fact in order to get the money, they have to steal it from somebody. And they steal it from productive resources, or they just print it out of thin air and making our problems that much worse.
Congressman Paul, what's your solution to the budget crisis?
Quit spending money. Across the board.
And there have been some Republican plans. Mr. President, what's your response?
Well, you know, the budget cuts proposed on your side of the aisle, they bankrupt America's future. Now we're talking about a 70% cut to clean energy, a 25% cut in education, and cuts in the college Pell Grants. Now, these are the kinds of cuts that tell us we can't afford the America that we believe in.
That is for sure. We can't afford government spending money on these things because the government is flat out broke and they've bankrupted our country. So if we had less government and let the people produce, we're not producers anymore. Productive jobs have gone overseas and all we have is debt. And then to argue that we need more money for Pell Grants, well, we don't have any money. There's no more people to steal it from and you just can't keep printing the money. So sure, it's a great idea to have Pell Grants and all these wonderful things, but the real truth is that you have less of it if you depend on the government to do it, and you should depend on free people taking care of themselves, and you would see so much more prosperity, so much better education, so much better transportation.
You say there's no more money to steal from people, but you say we could eliminate the deficit if we just tax rich people like me.
Absolutely. Now, I just think that the most fortunate among us can afford to pay a little more. Now, I don't need another tax cut. Warren Buffett doesn't need another tax cut. You don't need another tax cut. And, you know, that's what I have to say.
Yeah, I could pay more. We wealthy people could pay more. Can't we cover all this stuff?
No, it wouldn't even come close. It would be peanuts compared to what you need. But I'll tell you one thing I would go along with. You know, those liberal Democrats, you know, they like to tax and stick it to the rich and say, if we just tax the rich, we're going to solve all our problems. You know, the one thing I would concede, if you're rich and you're in the military-industrial complex and you're into corporatism and you live off the taxpayer and you're making a lot of money, like some of the companies that have gotten bailed out, they're back making money again. Why should the taxpayer support these corporations that liberal Democrats and a lot of conservatives support? We shouldn't allow them to rip us off. We shouldn't even give them the money. But in the meantime, I guess I wouldn't resist the fact that if somebody's made all their profits off the taxpayers, I'd tax them.
Thank you very much, Dr. Paul, and Mr. President, who's really actor Reggie Brown. But most of his words tonight were direct quotes from the real Barack Obama. When we come back, your questions for Congressman Ron Paul. We're back with Congressman Ron Paul and your questions. First from my Twitter page, someone who calls himself Dull Geek asks, ask him about immigration. He seems to support some very non-libertarian policies.
Well, I don't think I can answer the whole question there because there's a whole chapter in my book on immigration. But I take the position which probably doesn't satisfy too many on either end because, you know, the purest libertarian viewpoint is totally open borders.
Right.
And I don't endorse that. I don't think we are quite able to do that as long as people can come in here and benefit from the welfare system and they're compelled to, you know, be taken care of. I don't believe in the open borders, but I don't, you know, I don't like the idea of people wanting to build walls and fences and guns and thinking that the immigrant is the evil monster and the immigrant becomes you know, the scapegoat of everything. I think that's very, very bad. But it is a difficult problem. I do not support amnesty. I think if somebody sneaks across the border and somebody else is trying to follow the rules and can't get in, that they come across and soon they can become citizens and get to vote. So, but there's
Yes, no
way.
amnesty that they should.
No, I'm not for amnesty. But it's absolutely impossible to think that anybody, no matter how strongly people feel against illegals, you're not going to round up 12 or 15 million people. I mean, that doesn't make any sense.
Yes, sir.
Hi, Dr. Paul. Could you make your case for why we should get out of the UN?
Well, it's sacrifice of sovereignty. I consider it unconstitutional to deliver certain powers to the United Nations. I think the advice the founders gave us is pretty good advice, no entangling alliances, and that's an alliance that entangles us in too many things, and even NATO is another one of those alliances. But, you know, shortly after the UN was passed, we went to war in Korea under a UN resolution. The Congress wasn't even consulted. So I think it leads to nothing but trouble. If you like self-government, local government, state government over federal government, we certainly shouldn't consider the fact that we should have a world government. So I am opposed to all these international organizations.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, what is your take on the too big to fails? Because it seems pretty obvious that they're in need of an intervention, and they kind of have a money and power addiction. What do you say?
Too big to fail.
No, too big to fail is just a scare tactic for the big guys to get taken care of. So they say the world will come to end if General Motors would go bankrupt, so they get bailed out. Well, the truth is there were some good values to General Motors, and they should have gone through bankruptcy, and the good parts taken, and they should have been revamped.
What about the banks? We were told that if they don't bail them out, the whole system will collapse.
Well, that's what they're working on, what they did. They bailed out, and the whole system will collapse because it depended on the creation of $3.3 trillion by the Federal Reserve, and certain people got taken care of, but it brought on this horrendous recession. So, yes, it's failed, but they tend to think we were too big to fail, we bailed them out, and everything seems to be okay. But I think the American people know everything is not quite okay.
From my Facebook page, Dick Booth asks, how are your views on gay marriage and abortion different from Jerry Falwell's?
I don't know whether I can cite exactly what Jerry Falwell believed in, but
well, he's against gay marriage and abortion.
I think this argument about what is marriage and who can get married and to whom, I think in a free society it becomes totally irrelevant. I think the state, national, everybody should just be out of it. If somebody wants to call themselves married, fine. But nobody has a right to impose their values on somebody else, and that would be the solution. But there could be marriage, and you could get married in church or whatever. And I think the fact that the government gives us a license, why do we have to get a license to get married?
How about abortion? Should it be legal?
Abortion is tougher on how to handle it. I think the federal government should be out of it. I think it's atrocious, the fact that the federal government will transfer funds from people who believe strongly in right to life and give it to people to do abortions. I personally find abortions very offensive because I was responsible for protecting the unborn, and if I didn't do the right thing and an unborn child was injured, I could be sued, and I think rightfully so.
And to explain your answer, you are an obstetrician, and Jeremy asks, do you remember the feeling you had first time you delivered a baby?
Yes, I remember the feeling the mother had. Now, I think the first time was that I was pretty frightened about what was going on, but then after a while I learned how to do it and delivered 4,000 babies.
This guy, Gary Johnson from New Mexico, is looking pretty good to me if he'd take the back seat. What do you think?
Well, I don't know what it means for him to take a back seat.
Vice presidential.
Oh, I see.
Running mate.
No, Gary, I've known Gary a bit over the years, and matter of fact, he endorsed me in the last campaign, and now he's an announced candidate. When he was governor, I marveled at how he ran his governorship, because I think it was like 700 bills he vetoed, and very, very few got overridden, and he got reelected. So that's a pretty good record. But I don't know all the details of all his personal beliefs.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Congressman Paul, for your new book, Liberty Defined. Can you speak to one or two of the issues in that book?
I want to speak to the
Is she your publicist? What are some of the issues in Liberty Defined?
Okay, there are 50 different issues, so I can't list all 50. But marriage is one of them. Conscription is another one. The death penalty is another one. And some of the issues that we tend, just for emotional reason, disagree with. And it's not like I have all the answers. It's how I took the libertarian constitutional philosophy and applied it to these certain areas. And I think that you'll agree with some and maybe disagree with others, but there are many different issues. The immigration issue was one, and the things that tends to stir the emotions. Of course, I talk once again about foreign policy and of course on the abortion issue, because life to me is important, and I have trouble defending all liberty if life itself isn't of some value and it's recognized of some value. So that's how I come down on that issue. But there's a lot of other issues there as well.
Yes?
Yeah, Congressman Paul, considering that America, I think, spends as much in the military as all other nations combined, how much would you cut the military if you had a chance?
Well, I'm glad you used the right words. You talk about cutting military. A lot of people will propose that question and say, how much of the defense budget do you want to cut? I don't want to cut any defense, but the military budget is a good way to think about it, because it's mostly against our defense, because it jeopardizes us more than it helps us. Well, you could save a lot, hundreds of billions. I think in very short order you could cut that in half, and even less later on, because there's nobody likely to attack us. Who's going to invade this country? And if we had a different foreign policy, I don't think we have to decide that we have to kill everybody who says they're a Taliban member, that we have to go and kill them.
But people did attack us on September 11th.
They did, and they all died too. If you understand this and why it happened, it is related to the foreign policy. Bin Laden was very clear at that time on what he was trying to get us to do. His goal was to drag us into prolonged military actions in the Middle East and spread our military around. Also to bankrupt our country, because we would be spending so much money on it, and also to create dissent among the American people. So I think our foreign policy is something nobody wants to look to themselves and say, you know, maybe we're responsible for a little bit, you know, but if it's true, we shouldn't be afraid of that. I think what we should be afraid of is hiding from the truth, and we've done too much of that.
Dr. Paul, thank you very much for coming today. Next, the worst show on television. Do you know what that is? Here's a hint. I guarantee you've seen it. The worst show. Now, I don't know who wrote that line, probably some left-wing writer who lives in this neighborhood. They all do. But there just seems to be something about those of us who advocate for liberty that sets some people off, makes people angry. Last week at the Communist Party Summit in Cuba, they voted to let people buy and sell property for the first time in 50 years. And last year they announced they'd lay off 1 million public sector workers. The Castro government is going to fire government workers. In America, even the so-called radical Paul Ryan budget plan doesn't fire anybody. He doesn't close any departments, and yet he's attacked as radical and extreme. And this is the worst show on television, because I say government should be smaller? And Ron Paul, people don't just disagree with him. They say he's nuts. Not just liberals. Dick Morris said, I think he's horrific. Horrific? Morris says the congressman's horrific because he wants to end the war on terror and the war on drugs. Why is that horrific? You want to end those things. I want to end the war on drugs. I'm skeptical about the size of the war on terror. Am I horrific? I'll have to ask Dick about that the next time I see him in one of those green rooms out there. But there's all this anger about libertarian arguments, and it kind of creeps me out. But we do have real differences, so maybe that's natural. My wife says, why can't we have bipartisanship? You know, why can't we just be like this? But Ron Paul says this,
It's the bipartisanship of the welfare system, the warfare system, the monetary system, the challenge to our civil liberties. It all goes through with support from both parties. And I believe that we've had way too much bipartisanship for about 60 years.